Hi, I'm your host Dave Kemp, and this is Future Ear Radio. Each episode, we're breaking down one new thing, one cool new finding that's happening in the world of hearables, the world of voice technology. How are these worlds starting to intersect? How are these worlds starting to collide? What cool things are going to come from this intersection of technology? Without further ado, let's get on with the show. All right, so we're joined here today by Anna Pugh. Anna, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Hi, thanks for inviting me to the podcast. It's really exciting. I've been listening to quite a few of your podcasts previously. I'm Anna. I'm an audiologist hearing therapist. I've been a hearing therapist for over 30 years. Hearing therapy works with people with additional support needs as well as hearing aids. So we do lip reading, communication, auditory training, rehabilitation. So I've been working in the private sector in the statutory services in our NHS, which is our National Health Service, a little, as you say, like your VA, and in the voluntary sector as well. I'm currently working in the private sector. So it's across all three sort of aspects in the UK where we deliver hearing services and hearing healthcare.
Yeah, that's great. And so, obviously as an audiologist and an audiologist based in the UK, Anna provides a really interesting perspective. I talk a lot about, on this podcast about ways in which the technology is evolving and some of the ways that I think that ultimately will impact, the hearing aid patients of today. But I'm not in the field and people like Anna are. And so it's great to have someone like her come on and really provide a perspective as to, how this is all really starting to take shape in terms of the evolution of the hearing aids and in the ways in which that's starting to impact patients in a new way. So before we go into that, Anna, why don't you tell us a little bit about, obviously in the US, things have been evolving at a rapid pace from a legislative standpoint too, new ways that with like the Over-the-Counter Hearing Aid Act, there's going to be just new avenue points in which people can access these types of devices. Can you share a little bit about, say like the last 3 to 5 years in the UK and then into the next 3 to 5 years as things are going to be changing, like the overall landscape? Can you give us a picture of what all has sort of transpired and where this is headed in the UK?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because the UK has a very particular model. Over 70% of hearing aid sales in the UK are through hearing aids from the manufacturer's sales are produced through the NHS. So the NHS, the National Hearing Service, provides hearing aids free on loan to people, and it can be all adults. So anybody over the age of 18, generally people over 50, to be fair. And hearing aids are delivered free on loan. They tend to be the standard open fit BTE models, although some departments have additional funding and can provide different options, but it tends to be the simpler technologies. As I say, the NHS provides over 70% of the hearing aids that are worn in the UK. So in the UK, it's a very different field where we would necessarily think that hearing aids are worn because people buy them. There is an issue around ownership and hearing aid wear. Only 1 in 3 NHS hearing aids are worn, and that's not necessarily because people have to buy them because they're free on loan, but it's the value that they place on their hearing. And for audiologists, getting people with a mild hearing loss, getting people early enough in their hearing journey and their hearing healthcare journey is really, really important. And that has been changing in the last 3 years. The NHS have had to pull their services to a great extent. There's been something we call in the UK austerity processes, which is cuts to services and funding. So hospitals and health authorities have had to look very carefully about who they can distribute healthcare to. And to an extent, that's been shown in hearing healthcare that there's been limits to who the eligibility criteria for free on loan NHS hearing aids, and that has impacted significantly. The major audiology organisations supporting professionals have made campaigns to try and increase the awareness of hearing loss and the impacts of mild hearing loss on communication and isolation, particularly based on people like Barbara Timmer's work on mild onset hearing loss and those kind of things. And it has made some difference, but there are still some health authorities whose eligibility criteria have changed dramatically. So most people in the UK will have had NHS hearing aids, or at least had an NHS hearing test before they come into the private sector until they look at something different. And obviously within the private sector, we can offer more modern and up-to-date technology. In fact, the newest technologies, which are Bluetooth, which are receiver in the canal technologies, rechargeable technologies, all of those kind of things. So those kind of services tend to be only available in the private sector. Whereas in the US, when you get OTC, whilst that's over-the-counter hearing aids, that's going to make the product different. And there is an issue with the product and the rehabilitation aspect, and perhaps we'll talk a little bit about that later. But just the delivery of the product aspect for the NHS, most people will have tried an NHS hearing aid before they come to the private sector. So they will have had some experience of amplification.
Got it. So when you go, so like the way that you're describing this is most people, they enter into call it the funnel via the NHS. And then at some point they then move to the private side. What's usually the catalyst that pushes them toward the private side rather than just staying within the NHS?
Yeah, quite often it's the service level. It's the support that's available, the ongoing rehabilitation support. The NHS are unfortunately very limited, that they can't necessarily offer long-term ongoing rehabilitation. There are some hearing therapists in the NHS, but they're pretty few and far between. Sometimes it's the product is very simplistic, and people want more advanced technologies. Certainly we're finding that people are aware that there are Bluetooth connectivity hearing aids, there are rechargeable hearing aids. They're asking for that, so they're coming to the private sector for more advanced technology and more modern technology.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So is the private side, is there any type of like in the US, one of the big things is that there's not a whole lot of insurance coverage around hearing aids. And so therefore it's a pretty steep out-of-pocket cost. That's typically cited as one of the big limitations and reasons why the penetration rate is as low as it's kind of historically been. And that's why people are saying, that's one of the arguments for OTC, is that, maybe this will help more people acknowledge that, okay, I need to treat this and this is a good starting point. So let me ask you though, with the NHS with the private side, is there any type of government funding that you can get, or is it pretty much all?
No. It's that's what the NHS is for. So
Gotcha.
the NHS will provide a basic model of service delivery. And then if anybody wants anything additional, then that's the funding, the private payment issue. And yes, that's quite often cited as a reason not to purchase hearing aids, because they are, for many people, prohibitively expensive. There are cheaper avenues, or less expensive avenues these days, with more large companies providing sort of more accessible options. But in general, it is an issue. I think the move towards separating product, the actual hearing aid, to the rehabilitation, to the service, to the support, to the assessment, is certainly what's required. And I think that's something that we can talk about again. And I know that you talked about with Jeff Cooling recently, and I'm presuming with other audiologists that you've spoken to.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I want to say to this, like, so a really interesting, thought that I've been thinking about is, so with the NHS, you've just described that you get these free devices, but you kind of get a bare minimum service,
Hmm.
and you get a bare minimum with the technology.
Yeah.
And for a long time, there's been this argument in the U.S. that whenever we look at the hearing aid penetration rates, we say, well, look at Europe, look at Japan. I don't know what the situation's like in Japan, but I know that a lot of the time these two markets get cited because they have these free devices. But after talking
Mm.
to you for a little bit, you realize that what's actually happening, because the penetration rates are similar in places like the UK as they are in the US, they're pretty low. So even if you have these free devices, and you give this offering, the problem, I think, is that the value proposition still isn't strong enough. And
Yeah.
the reason being is that, we're talking about something that it's an acknowledgement, I think, in many people's eyes, and this ties into the whole stigma, is that, I'm old. Like, that's sort of the notion I think that people have to accept. And that's something that a lot of people are in denial about. And if you're not going to provide a really high quality service, and you're not going to provide the types of devices that are available today, even if it's all free, I just don't think that's all that compelling to people. And so for me, that makes a whole lot of sense as to why these two markets, even though it's perceived that, well, in the UK, you can get these devices for free, when you get a little bit of a better idea, you realize that I would imagine it's not all that compelling for a lot of people, even if they really need that hearing assistance. They aren't perceiving it as something that is a need to have for them.
I think you're exactly right, and I think there is such an issue still with stigma and
Hmm.
with being old. And I still get patients saying, "I'm not old enough for hearing aids yet."
Yeah.
It's okay, dear, but you're sort of 84. I think you're probably it's okay, but we start talking about, we start to lose our hearing at 47, and all on average, and all of those things. But Mark Track and Eurotrack and other sources have delineated that it's not necessarily the cost proposition, it is the value proposition. It's the how much value do people put on their hearing loss.
Hmm.
We always cite the Helen Keller quote about eyes and ears and those kind of things, but it is that people don't place much value on their hearing. And I think that will change. When you were talking earlier about going forward, I think that hearables, and certainly my generation, I'm in my 60s now, so my generation are more used to technology. We're expecting a high level of technology, but
Hmm.
we're more accepting of technology. So I
Totally.
quite often will have earbuds in my ears. I will quite often use different technologies. So that is it will become a lot more acceptable. It will become a lot more usable, and I think the more ordinary hearing aids or hearables or the technology becomes, the more ubiquitous it becomes, the more easily adopted it will become. The fact that hearing aids look like hearing aids,
Hmm.
and whoever designs them it's never had to wear them. um, you know the fact that hearing aids look like hearing aids and people don't want to, it's still the stigma. I don't
Hmm.
want to wear hearing aids. On saying that, I mean, there are groups who talk about being proud to wear hearing aids, and
Hmm.
they decorate their hearing aids and they show off their hearing aids. That tends to be a younger population, and a population who have grown up wearing hearing aids. Whereas the majority of people that I meet are people with an acquired hearing loss that happens in adulthood gradually, who really don't want to be old and don't want
Totally.
to appear to be old. And I
I
always say to my patients, mishearing and getting things wrong makes you seem older than just shoving a bit of kit in
I
your ear.
know. That's excellent point, and I think you're spot on. I tend to think that I don't think the stigma is necessarily around the notion that you have a disability, as much as it's a acknowledgement for many that they're old. And
Yeah,
I think that is a really hard reality. Like, regardless of where this goes in the form factor, at the end of the day, acknowledging your own mortality is something that no one wants to do. And
yeah.
so we're talking about, stigmatizing a device that is more or less in people's eyes representing this like next phase of their life that's just closer to death. And that's really
and
uncomfortable.
and we have to take some responsibility for that, because if we as audiologists and hearing therapists and people in the hearing healthcare aren't talking about hearing loss happening gradually and happening when you're in your 40s and your 50s,
Totally.
if we're not talking about it then it suddenly becomes a big thing when you're in your 70s and your 80s. Whereas, we should be catching people early. We should be talking about it as part of the natural progression of life as a woman when you go through pregnancy, puberty, and the menopause. When we talk about work noise, when we talk about diabetes, when we talk about all of those kind of things, we should be talking about hearing loss as natural part of the process of who we are, rather than waiting till we get to a certain age and go, oh, you're deaf.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Like the way that I think about this is the reason I'm so adamant that hearables are a really good thing for this industry, but like just broadly speaking around the stigma, is that if more younger generations are adopting, say, AirPods, and ultimately you create a user base of hundreds of millions of people, and you're creating all kinds of new applications and stuff literally designed for an in-the-ear device. And then as a secondary byproduct of that, hearing aids can take advantage of all this. I tend to think that like in 5 years or so, when there's tons of new capabilities and tons of new reasons to wear an in-the-ear device, we're moving toward a point where you can wear something that looks like a hearing aid without necessarily having to acknowledge or give off the perception that you're wearing it because your hearing loss is deteriorated, and more or less acknowledging that you've gone old. It's more like, well, I'm wearing this because it's got, my voice assistants in there and all these biometric sensors. Like I need to monitor my blood pressure for hypertension and like all these different things that these devices can ultimately do. And it's just like, oh, and by the way, mine amplifies as well. Mine's a hearing aid. And down the line, who knows what these things are all going to look like? They might all start to blend and take different shapes to where, AirPods might look a whole lot like hearing aids, or hearing aids might look a whole lot like AirPods, where you get to the point where everybody's wearing something in and around their ear and nobody really knows why everybody's wearing them. We've just sort of become accustomed, like, oh yeah, that's like their in-the-ear device that they wear. And I feel like that can be, because then you're never having to necessarily wear something that is representing like I'm old. It's more like I'm just wearing my ear-worn device. And I think hearables will be one of the main drivers for that, because it's like the idea of like a computer in your ear and building all the functionality around that. It gives a rise to this like whole new way in which we perceive these devices, which is a whole lot more utility than a single function device, like a traditional hearing aid prior to the Bluetooth connectivity.
I think you're so right, and I think that's really, really important, and I that's why I'm so involved in what happens with voice, because I think it's really important. I think that's certainly the way forward. The way that we use voice in other settings other than the home, once we start to use it in the community, once we start using it to use Google Maps while we're walking along the road rather than looking on our phone, whilst we're doing all of those kind of things, I think it becomes more accessible. It comes more every day. It doesn't become a huge issue. I think that's really the way forward, and that's why I'm really keen on talking to people and listening and making sure that when they are looking at that, they are thinking about hearing loss within that concept, when they're thinking about using noise reduction and all those things, and what people call ambient environments, all those kind of ecologies are really, really important.
So you mentioned Jeff Cooling a little bit earlier, and one of my favorite parts of that conversation was when we were talking about like this idea where the whole business model flips from being widget based sales where you sell a few devices at a high margin. It moves more toward a service oriented one where the volume in which you see people goes way up. And he talked a lot about like these ideas of like service packages. So can you speak to ways in which you kind of see like, because I agree with Jeff. I think that the key asset that providers have is their expertise. And I think that as the market becomes more saturated with options, there's going to be it will create a rising demand of expertise. You'll need help to actually navigate this landscape. And I think this idea of establishing a relationship early on, that's why I think it's important that providers like really look at OTC as a way to maybe just create a relationship with somebody and get them in the door. You're not going to necessarily profit off them initially, but these are people that you can build a relationship on. And it's again, it's this idea that your hearing loss doesn't really ever go away. It's a matter of how do you mitigate it? How do you preserve it so that it, you can live into your 70s and your 80s. And even if you have a loss, it doesn't get a whole lot worse than when it was 50 and you were starting to really treat it. So I would love to get your perspective on like how you see the provider evolving in terms of the ways that they can provide new types of services, or even just re-emphasizing some of the things that maybe need to be better communicated to the public as to like, this is what a hearing care provider really does. And this is why you should involve me in that process rather than just try to do this on your own.
I'm that speaks so much to what I spend a lot of my time ranting on about, to be fair. To anybody that will stand still and listen long enough. One of the things that's really important is that we need to think that audiology is a long game. On average, people wait 7 to 10 years before they do anything about a hearing loss. So we've got that population that are thinking that I might not hear very well, but they're not ready to do anything about it because they don't want this stigma, they don't want this hearing aid. So that's why I think all these new technologies will tap into that group of people. I think that there definitely has to be a separation between the product and the service and the support and the assessment and all of those kind of things. And I always say to students and everybody that, as audiologists, we need to change. We need to address this. Otherwise, we're going to go the way of the typesetters. And just to sort of say, if people don't know what a typesetter is, when the printing press commercially was first available in 1450, they had typesetters, and you couldn't imagine having a book because obviously it moved from handwritten manuscripts to the printed page, and nobody could imagine not having books. And we still have books, but we don't have typesetters anymore.
Totally.
Because, it's all done automatically. And even though we are qualified professionals, if we put all our eggs in the product basket, we are losing, we're going to be obsolete. We're not going to be needed. So we do have to address how we can support people by auditory training, by assessment, by support, by encouraging and enabling people to use their technology as soon as they start noticing that they're not necessarily always getting something. A little bit of augmentation, not necessarily a hearing aid, but a little bit of augmentation early on will help people develop the skills and the encouragement to recognize their hearing deterioration and work from that. And so that's certainly something that I'm very keen on. And as a hearing therapist, that's really my stock in trade. We use hearing aids as an accessory, as an augmentation, rather than the core of what we do. So it really is, it's moving that into audiology in the mainstream, that we need to become those professionals. And in the UK, it's very difficult because of the model that we have, the NHS or the private sector, and ne'er the twain shall meet quite often, unfortunately. So the private sector business model is quite often predicated on this product sales. And I think that's, I'm concerned that that's not a sustainable business model going forward. I think it's going to last for at least until it will see me out, but I don't think, for my students and for people that I talk to all the time, I don't think it's a sustainable model. I think we need to be much more in the mode, in the moment, to see the advantages of the technology that's available. And we need to make our space in that environment.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. I love what you said about it being a long game. That's really well said. And I agree. I think that there's a lot of really smart hearing care professionals out there and soon to be professionals that they'll figure out ways to adapt to this. I mean, again, the key is that they have this really what I perceive to be a in-demand asset that I think is just going to increasingly become more in demand, which is their expertise. And so I think that the next 10 years, call it, will be all about how do we figure out a way to reposition our business models so that we're really emphasizing our number one asset that is extremely hard for any type of online service, automated service, do-it-yourself service to replicate. And I think that is going to be just their general expertise of everything that goes into this. And like you said, I think that if this can be, whether it be OTC or it just be new service-based models that are geared toward helping people to just get started on this journey, if I think you can get people in the door way earlier than that 7 to 10 years that you cited, if it's more like people look at this and they wait only a couple years, and maybe some of this is driven by the technology because they're intrigued by all the cool new stuff that these devices can do, but also intrigued by the idea that, I can establish a relationship with my hearing care professional that's going to just more or less guide me through this. And I don't need to necessarily worry about this. This doesn't need to be something that's super top of mind for me because I know that I have an expert that can really help to navigate me through all this.
Yeah. And I think that's right. And I think we need to sort of differentiate between hearing, which is what we can do with the technology, and listening and communication skills, and separate them out. And perhaps we need to change the language, perhaps we need to change the approach. And I think we need to use the technology. When we talk about the newer technologies that can identify falls and biomechanical stuff, it's all really important. And I think that, and we start to put ordinary voice technology into equipment that can also act as hearing aids. I think it's really exciting. I think it will make a huge difference, and I think as audiologists we need to position ourselves so that we're there to offer that professional guidance and support.
Yeah. Could not agree more, Anna. Could not agree more. So thank you so much for taking the time, come on today, share all your insight and your knowledge. This has been an awesome conversation. Thank you to everybody who tuned in and listened all the way through to the end of the episode. That's all we got this week. We'll chat with you next time. Cheers. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Future Ear Radio. For more content like this, just head over to futureear.co, where you can read all the articles that I've been writing these past few years on the worlds of voice technology and hearables and how the two are beginning to intersect. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll chat with you next time.